desolate wind, ancient and unyielding, whispered across the dust-choked plains, carrying with it the silent scream of forgotten injustices. This is not a tale for the faint of heart, nor for those who cling to simple truths, for humanity's darkest corners often hide its most surprising glimmers. It is a story etched in the unforgiving landscape, a narrative born from the stark clash of brutal reality and an unexpected flicker of conscience. Before we get into this tale, let us know in the comments where you're watching from, and subscribe if you want more content like this one. For some, the world was a vast hunting ground. For others, an endless prison. Elias, a man whose name was often spoken in hushed tones, usually accompanied by the sting of whiskey or the gleam of cold steel, rode with the stoicism of one who had seen too much and felt too little. His saddle leather, cracked and worn, was as much a part of him as the grim set of his jaw, the perpetual shadow beneath his hat brim. He was an outlaw, a ghost flitting between the fringes of a society that had long since cast him out, and he asked for nothing more than to be left alone, his solitude a self-imposed penance for sins whispered only by the wind. But the vast emptiness of the land, stretching endlessly beneath an indifferent sky, held its own brutal surprises. It was the smell that caught him first, a faint, almost imperceptible tang of fear and desperation clinging to the dry air, stronger than the parched earth or the distant scent of sage. He reined in his horse, a creature as wary and solitary as its rider, its ears twitching, sensing the disturbance in the oppressive silence. A lone, skeletal tree, twisted by relentless gales, stood like a gallows in the middle of nowhere, its barren branches clawing at the pale sky, and beneath it, a figure, not a shadow, not a trick of the light, but a stark, undeniable presence. A girl, impossibly young, impossibly frail, bound to the gnarled trunk by a heavy iron chain, glinting cruelly in the harsh sunlight. Her head, a tangle of matted dark hair, was slumped against her chest, her limbs impossibly thin, wasted by hunger and thirst. She was a silent testament to a savagery that defied understanding. A living question mark burned into the desolate canvas of the frontier. The sight hit Elias with the force of a physical blow, a sudden, unexpected rupture in the hardened shell he had built around his soul. It was a violation so profound, so utterly without human decency, that it stirred something dormant within him, something he had long believed to be dead. This girl, barely more than a child, chained and left to die in this forgotten place, was a mirror reflecting the ugliness he knew existed in the world, an ugliness he had often contributed to in his own way, but never with such cold, calculated cruelty. Her suffering was a tangible thing, a weight in the air pulling him inexorably closer, shattering the illusion of his own detachment. The iron links, rusted and unyielding, seemed to hum with the quiet despair of their captive, a sound only Elias could hear in the profound stillness of that forgotten place. He dismounted slowly, his movements deliberate, his hand instinctively resting on the worn grip of his pistol, not out of fear of the girl, but of the unseen architects of such cruelty. The earth beneath his boots felt suddenly fragile, as if the ground itself might crack open and swallow this grotesque scene whole. As he drew nearer, the details sharpened into agonizing clarity. Her skin, the color of rich earth, taut over visible bones, her lips, cracked and bleeding, her clothes, mere tattered rags clinging to her emaciated frame. Her eyes, when she finally lifted her head, were vast, unfathomable pools of pain and a primal, animalistic fear, devoid of any childlike innocence. They held no tears, only an ancient weariness that belied her tender years. She was a ghost, yet undeniably present, a raw nerve exposed to the elements. "Girl," he rasped, his voice rough from disuse, a strange, guttural sound in the vast silence. She flinched, a spasm of terror rippling through her skeletal body, and tried to shrink deeper into the tree trunk, as if she could somehow become one with the bark, disappear from his sight. He saw the marks on her wrists, deep, festering wounds where the iron had gnawed at her flesh, saw the dull glint of a padlock. No key, only the grim certainty of a tool. He felt a familiar knot of anger tighten in his gut, a cold, hard ember that had fueled many of his past transgressions. This was not the kind of fight he sought, but it was a fight he recognized, An injustice that clawed at something buried deep within his hardened heart. He reached for the hatchet tucked into his saddle, its blade glinting dully as he drew it. Her eyes, wide with a new terror, fixed on the tool, perhaps fearing another torment. He moved with a practiced economy of motion, the hatchet rising and falling with a controlled force, striking the chain precisely at a weaker link. The clang of metal on metal echoed sharply, unnaturally loud in the vast quiet, followed by the dull thud of severed iron against dry earth. The chain fell away, a broken serpent at her feet, freeing her but not releasing her from the invisible bonds of her trauma. She didn't move, didn't cry out, just remained frozen, trembling. A bird whose cage door had opened but whose wings were still bound by fear. Elias stood over her, his shadow long and imposing in the afternoon sun. He had done the deed, yet the question remained. What now? The silence stretched thick with unspoken questions, with the weight of her suffering, and with the sudden, unsettling burden of responsibility that now rested on his shoulders. He was an outlaw, a solitary wanderer. He took lives. He didn't save them. This deviation from his hardened path felt profoundly unsettling, a disruption to the carefully constructed equilibrium of his existence. Yet, leaving her here, knowing what he now knew, was an impossibility, a moral breach even he, in his compromised state, could not countenance. The desert, unforgiving and indifferent, was no place for a child, especially one so broken. The girl remained utterly still, her emaciated frame a testament to the brutal indifference of the world. She watched him, her eyes unblinking, holding a depth of fear that chilled Elias to the bone. He had seen fear countless times, in the eyes of men he had bested, in the fleeting expressions of those he had robbed, but never this profound, hollowed-out terror that seemed to have consumed her very being. It was the fear of an animal trapped, not understanding why it had been freed. "Can you walk?" he asked, his voice softer this time, attempting to strip it of its usual rough edges, though it still sounded alien in his own ears. She didn't respond, didn't even register the question, her gaze fixed on some point beyond him, perhaps recalling the horrors that had led her to this plight. It was a silence louder than any scream, a testament to a spirit perhaps too broken to even vocalize its pain. He knelt, his knees protesting, and offered her a canteen of water, its metal cool against his calloused hand. She recoiled slightly, then hesitantly, almost imperceptibly, leaned forward, her parched lips barely touching the spout. She drank, not in greedy gulps but in small, careful sips, as if afraid the water itself might vanish. Each swallow was a monumental effort, a visible struggle for a body that had been pushed beyond its limits. He watched the water revive a flicker of life in her eyes, a minute softening of the stark terror, and felt a strange, unfamiliar tug. He was no healer, no savior. His life was one of constant flight, of calculated risks and sudden violence. Taking on this child, this fragile, wounded creature, was an absurdity, an act that defied every instinct of self-preservation he possessed. Yet the image of her chained to that tree, starving, alone, had branded itself onto his mind, a mark more indelible than any scar from a bullet or a knife. He couldn't shake it. He wouldn't. He helped her slowly, gently, to her feet, her limbs wobbling precariously beneath her. She was lighter than he expected, a stark reminder of her near-death state. She stumbled, and he caught her, her weight surprisingly feather-light against his arm. Her skin was feverish, her body barely holding on. It was then, amidst the dust and silence, that a fragmented image flashed through Elias's mind. A small, faded photograph, tucked deep within a leather-bound book he kept hidden, of a child with eyes that held a similar vulnerability, a similar fear, a child he had failed to protect. The memory was fleeting, a phantom pain, but it anchored him to this present moment, to this girl. He wrapped her in a spare blanket from his saddlebag, shielding her from the biting wind, a small act of kindness in a world that offered so little. He lifted her onto his horse, her body stiff with distrust, then mounted behind her, holding her gently, awkwardly against him. The sun dipped lower, casting long, distorted shadows across the endless plain. They rode in silence, the rhythm of the horse's hooves a steady counterpoint to the thrumming tension in the air. He steered them away from the faint, forgotten trails, deeper into the unforgiving vastness, towards a hidden cove in the rocks he knew, a place of temporary sanctuary, far from the cruel eyes of man. The hidden alcove in the jagged rock face was less a shelter and more a gaping wound in the earth, a place where the sun rarely reached, where the air hung heavy with the scent of damp stone and dried dust. Elias had used it before, a bolt hole when the hounds of law or retribution got too close. It was a grim sanctuary, but it was safe for now. He eased the girl from the horse, her body still stiff, her gaze darting like a trapped bird. He laid her gently on the makeshift bedroll he'd fashioned, a small fire already crackling in the cold stone hearth, its meager warmth battling the chill that seeped from the ancient rocks. Her eyes, still wide and vacant, absorbed the flickering light, reflecting a primordial fear that seemed etched into her very bones. He offered her dried meat, tough and lean, and more water. She ate slowly, cautiously, as if each bite was a foreign object, her movements still hesitant, mistrustful. He watched her, a silent observer of a silent suffering, recognizing the echoes of his own desolate past in her guarded eyes. He was a man accustomed to solitude, to the quiet hum of his own thoughts, the constant vigilance against a world that sought to break him. Now, her presence, though silent, filled the space, disrupting the familiar rhythm of his lonely existence. He wondered about her name, about where she came from, about the unspeakable circumstances that had led to her being chained and left for dead. But he did not ask. He had learned long ago that some wounds were too deep for words, some stories too painful to be told aloud, especially when the teller was still clinging to the ragged edges of survival. His own past was a tapestry woven with such threads, betrayals, losses, desperate choices that had carved him into the man he was, a hardened survivor, an outlaw by necessity, not by choice, a memory sharp and unbidden, pierced through the quiet of the night, a flash of a child's small hand clutching his own, a whisper of a promise he couldn't keep. The memory was brief, a flicker of warmth quickly extinguished by the cold reality of the present. He pushed it away, as he always did, focusing instead on the practicalities, checking his supplies, cleaning his pistol, listening to the vast empty sounds of the night, always listening. The girl, her breathing shallow, finally drifted into a fitful sleep, her small body curled into itself, seeking comfort that wasn't there. He sat watching her, the firelight casting long, dancing shadows on the cave walls, the only sounds the crackle of the flames and the distant howl of a lone coyote. He was an accidental protector, bound by an invisible chain to a destiny he hadn't chosen, pulled into a life he had spent years trying to outrun. The world outside the cave was harsh, unforgiving, and riddled with dangers, both human and natural. But the greater danger, he knew, lay in the unspoken pasts that lay between them, like dormant embers waiting for a breath of air to ignite them anew. He was an outlaw. His very existence was a crime. Taking this child in was an act that could seal his fate, drawing eyes he desperately needed to avoid. Yet, as he watched her fragile form, a strange sense of resolve began to settle within him, cold and heavy as the mountain stone itself. He would see this through, whatever the cost. The silence of the cave, once his solitude, now felt heavy with a shared, uncertain future. Days bled into one another within the confines of the hidden cave, the passage of time marked only by the shifting light at the entrance and the subtle, almost imperceptible changes in the girl. She ate more. Her sips of water became less hesitant gulps, and the raw, animalistic fear in her eyes began to recede, replaced by a deep, cautious wariness. Elias, for his part, maintained his distance, a silent sentinel, observing her, providing for her, but offering no words, no comfort, no false promises. He was a wall, imposing and unyielding, yet within him, a subtle shift was occurring. He found himself studying her, not just for signs of distress, but for glimpses of the person she might have been before the world broke her. He saw the resilience etched in her young face, the stubborn refusal to simply cease, despite everything. Her silence was profound, a barrier more formidable than any physical restraint. He spoke only when necessary, his voice gruff, terse, devoid of emotion. Water, eat, sleep. Yet one evening, as the sun dipped below the jagged horizon, painting the sky in fiery hues, she spoke. Her voice was a fragile whisper, barely audible above the crackle of the fire, parched and rough from disuse. What's your name?" The words hung in the air, shattering the carefully constructed quietude. A fragile bridge cast across the chasm of their shared silence. Elias froze. His hand paused in the act of cleaning his rifle. He hadn't expected it, hadn't prepared for it. Names held power, held stories, held connections. He hadn't used his own name in years, preferring the anonymous moniker Ghost or simply Outlaw. He considered ignoring her, but something in the quiet intensity of her gaze, a spark of nascent courage, compelled him. "Elias," he grunted, the name sounding foreign, almost painful on his tongue. She nodded slowly, absorbing it, as if testing the weight of the syllables. Her eyes, still wary, met his directly for the first time, holding a fleeting flicker of something akin to curiosity. It was a small moment, yet it felt monumental, a subtle shifting of the vast landscape between them. That night, Elias found himself recounting a fragmented piece of his own past. Spurred by an impulse he couldn't name, he spoke not of his crimes, not of the bounty on his head, but of a different kind of wound, a deeper, older scar. He spoke of a family, long lost to the indifferent cruelty of a world that cared little for those who had nothing, of a small farm swallowed by debt and deceit, of a sister he couldn't protect. His words were sparse, stripped bare of sentimentality, raw and honest in their pain. He didn't look at her as he spoke, but he felt her presence, a silent witness to a truth he rarely aired. He spoke of how he became an outlaw, not out of malice, but out of a twisted sense of justice, striking back at a system that had devoured everything he held dear. He didn't ask for her story, didn't demand an exchange, but in sharing a piece of himself, he offered an unspoken invitation, a silent acknowledgement of their shared brokenness. The air in the cave, usually heavy with secrets, now seemed to thrum with a fragile, nascent connection. The fragile threads of their nascent connection were tested daily by the harsh realities of their existence. Elias, for all his attempts at stoicism, found himself increasingly aware of the girl's presence, the quiet trust that slowly, imperceptibly, began to replace her initial terror. She watched him with an unsettling intensity, her gaze like a physical touch, probing the depths of his hardened exterior. One morning, as he sharpened his hunting knife by the fire, she spoke again, her voice still rough but gaining a quiet strength. "My name is Lena." The name hung in the air, a small defiant declaration, a reclamation of self in a world that had tried to strip her of everything. Elias nodded, a subtle acknowledgement, but offered no words. What could he say? Welcome, Lena, to this life of shadow and flight. His past was a heavy cloak, and now, by virtue of his choice, she was slowly becoming entangled in its folds. The silence that followed was different now, not empty, but filled with the unspoken weight of their shared circumstances. Lena slowly began to mimic his movements, learning to tend the fire, to clean the meager game he brought back, her small hands surprisingly deft. She was a quick study, a survivor in the truest sense, and her resilience was a stark contrast to her initial fragility. Yet the question of her true past, the specific horrors that had led her to that gnarled tree, remained an open wound, a mystery that pulsed beneath the surface of their quiet companionship. Elias sensed it, a deep-seated trauma that manifested in sudden, silent tremors, in the distant look that sometimes clouded her eyes, a look that spoke of unspeakable things. He often found her tracing patterns on the cave floor with a stick, lost in a world only she could see. He did not press, did not pry. He knew that some truths, like poisoned arrows, could only be pulled free when the time was right, or not at all. But the quietude of their hidden existence could not last forever. The world outside, cruel and indifferent, had a way of finding those who sought to disappear. One scorching afternoon, while out checking his traps, Elias saw them, a faint plume of dust on the distant horizon, too large, too purposeful to be a lone rider. A posse, the law, or perhaps something worse, something specifically looking for a runaway, a lost piece of property. His blood ran cold. He had been too complacent, too focused on this unexpected burden. He spurred his horse back to the cave, the urgency a bitter taste in his mouth. "We have to go," he stated, his voice flat, devoid of negotiation. Lena looked up, her eyes immediately sharp, sensing the shift in his demeanor. She didn't question, didn't hesitate. Her survival instincts, honed by unimaginable hardship, were finely tuned. As they prepared, Lena retrieved something from a hidden fold in her tattered dress. A small, crudely carved wooden bird, worn smooth by countless touches. It was her only possession, a silent testament to a life she had lost. Elias saw it, a flicker of something in her eyes, a profound sorrow that momentarily broke through her stoic facade. This small carved bird was more than just a toy. It was a symbol, a fragile link to a past that was now dangerously close to consuming their present. The decision was made, unspoken but understood. They would move deeper into the unforgiving wilderness, further from the grasping hands of a world that sought to reclaim its property, no matter the cost in human lives. The vastness of the plains, once a desolate haven, now felt like a sprawling open trap. The posse, a dark stain against the vast pale canvas of the distant plains, was closing in. Elias knew their kind, relentless, driven by the scent of bounty or the twisted notion of justice. He pushed his horse hard, Lena clinging tightly to him, her small body surprisingly resilient against the pounding gallop. The wooden bird, clutched in her hand, was her only anchor in the swirling chaos of their flight. He cursed inwardly, his carefully cultivated solitude shattered, his life once again defined by the relentless pursuit of others. This was not just about him anymore. It was about her, about the young life he had inadvertently, inexplicably chosen to protect. He recognized the irony. An outlaw, a man who had lived outside the law for so long, now risking everything to save someone from its cruel grip. They rode for hours, the sun beating down, the dust clinging to their skin and clothes like a second skin. Elias knew a few more hidden trails, forgotten passes through the Badlands, places where the earth itself seemed to rise up in jagged defiance. He pushed the horse to its limits, the animal's strained breathing a counterpoint to the thrumming fear in his own chest. He had to put distance between them and the posse, had to lose them in the labyrinthine canyons and sun-baked arroyos. As they navigated a narrow, winding gulch, a sudden sharp crack echoed from above. A rifle shot. It whizzed past his ear, too close, followed by the scattering of loose rocks. They had been spotted. The posse had riders with a keen eye, or perhaps they had stumbled upon a scout. Elias instinctively urged his horse faster, ducking low, pulling Lena down with him. There was no time for thought, only reaction. He knew this kind of pursuit rarely ended well, especially for those deemed property. Another shot, closer this time, struck the rock face near them, sending up a shower of sparks. Lena gasped, a small choked sound, her fear palpable against his back. He had to make a stand, or they would both be caught. He knew the odds were stacked against them, but the image of her back at that tree, chained and broken, fueled a grim determination. He spotted a shallow cave, barely more than an overhang just ahead. "In there," he yelled, his voice raw. He dismounted quickly, pulling Lena behind him, shielding her with his body as he drew his pistol. The sound of hooves grew louder, closer, echoing ominously in the confined space of the gulch. The figures emerged from the dust, silhouetted against the blinding sun. 3 men, hard-faced, grim, their eyes narrowed in predatory focus. They were slave catchers, Elias realized, not just lawmen. Their faces were etched with the cold certainty of their cruel profession, their eyes reflecting the societal biases that allowed such inhumanity to flourish. Well, looks like the ghost finally found himself a companion. One of them sneered, his voice dripping with menace. And a valuable one, too. The owner's been mighty keen on getting this one back. Elias said nothing, his gaze locked on the lead man, his pistol steady. He knew this man, or his type, a purveyor of human misery, cloaked in the false righteousness of ownership. The air grew thick with tension, a suffocating weight. The fight was inevitable. He had chosen his side, an outlaw protecting a soul deemed property, and there was no turning back now. This was his reckoning, not just with the law, but with the remnants of his own fractured morality. The lead slave catcher, a burly man with a cruel sneer permanently etched onto his face, dismounted slowly, his eyes fixed on Lena. "That's our property, outlaw. Hand her over, and maybe we let you ride free." His words were like a barbed wire across the raw wound of Elias's conscience. Property. The word was a foul taste in his mouth, a stain on the very essence of humanity. Lena flinched behind him, a barely perceptible tremor, but her small hand tightened on his arm, a silent plea, a desperate trust. Elias's grip on his pistol remained steady, his eyes cold and unwavering. "She ain't property," he stated, his voice low, a dangerous rumble that echoed in the narrow gulch. "She's a human being." The slave catcher scoffed, a dry, dismissive sound. "Fancy words from a man with a bounty on his head. Makes no difference what you call her. She belongs to Mr. Caldwell, and he wants her back, badly." The other two men fanned out, their rifles poised, their faces impassive. Elias knew this was no negotiation. This was a confrontation, a collision of worlds, of ideologies, a battle for a single life. He wasn't a hero, never claimed to be, but in that moment, with Lena's fragile weight against his back, something elemental stirred within him. The injustice was too stark, too raw. He remembered the chains, the tree, the starvation. He remembered the phantom pain of his own past, of promises broken and innocence lost. "Then you'll have to take her," Elias said, his voice flat, devoid of emotion, but with an underlying current of steel. The slave catcher's sneer tightened. "Fool, you truly think you can fight all three of us?" Before the man could even finish the sentence, Elias moved. It wasn't a hero's charge, but an outlaw's desperate, calculating thrust. His pistol barked once, shattering the tense silence, the shot echoing off the rock walls. The lead slave catcher staggered back, a look of shocked disbelief on his face, his hand clutching his chest as he fell, a dark stain blossoming on his rough-spun shirt. The two remaining men froze for a split second, their surprise evident, before their rifles came up spitting fire. Elias threw himself to the ground, pulling Lena with him, the bullets kicking up dust and stone where they had just stood. He returned fire, aiming for the legs, for anything that would slow them down, disrupt their formation. He was outnumbered, outgunned, but he had the element of surprise and the fierce, unreasoning protectiveness that had taken root within him. A bullet grazed his arm, a searing pain, but he ignored it, his focus absolute. Lena, instead of screaming, was surprisingly calm. She watched with wide, horrified eyes, but she didn't hinder him. In fact, she seemed to brace herself, a silent, tiny warrior in the midst of chaos. The fight was brutal, swift, and unforgiving. Elias fought with the desperation of a cornered animal, driven by a primal need to survive, to protect. He was a flawed man, yes, morally ambiguous, but in this moment, his actions were pure, born of a stark, undeniable choice. The world had offered him a choice: abandon the innocent or fight. He had chosen to fight. The gun smoke filled the air, acrid and metallic, mingling with the scent of fear and fresh blood. The dust settled slowly, thick and heavy, like a shroud over the silenced gulch. Two of the slave catchers lay still, broken figures on the harsh earth, their greed and cruelty now mere dust motes in the indifferent wind. The third, wounded and groaning, scrambled away, a pathetic broken figure retreating into the shadows, a witness to the unexpected fury of an outlaw's conscience. Elias stood, his breath ragged, the pain in his arm a dull throb. His clothes were torn, stained with dust and blood, but his eyes, though weary, held a grim satisfaction. He had fought, and for now, he had won. But the victory felt hollow, a temporary reprieve in an endless war against a world steeped in injustice. Lena emerged from behind him, her face pale, her eyes still wide with shock and the lingering echo of violence. She looked at the fallen men, then at Elias, a silent question in her gaze. There was no triumph in her expression, only a profound, heartbreaking understanding of the cost of freedom. "We need to move," Elias rasped, his voice hoarse, the words cutting through the heavy silence. He didn't wait for a response, didn't offer comfort. Comfort was a luxury they couldn't afford, a weakness in this unforgiving land. He helped her onto his horse, then mounted behind her, his movements stiff with pain and exhaustion. The sun was dipping below the horizon, painting the sky in fiery streaks of orange and purple, a beautiful, indifferent backdrop to the brutal realities they faced. They rode away from the gulch, leaving the silent dead behind, leaving behind another testament to the violent choices Elias had made. But this time, the violence had been different. It wasn't for profit or vengeance or mere survival. It was for her, a decision born of an unexpected surge of humanity in a man who had long believed himself beyond such things. The act, stark and brutal, had forged a new kind of chain between them, an unbreakable bond forged in blood and desperation. As they rode deeper into the twilight, the land became wilder, more desolate, a landscape mirroring the untamed spirit within Elias. He was an outlaw still, but his motivations had shifted, subtly, irrevocably. He was no longer merely fleeing, but actively, defiantly protecting. Lena, cradled against his back, was a warm weight, a silent affirmation of the path he had chosen. She was his shadow now, and he her unlikely shield. The silence between them was no longer just a barrier, but a shared space, filled with unspoken fears and a nascent, fragile hope. He knew the dangers ahead were immense. The law would be after him with renewed vigor. The tale of the slave catchers would spread, painting him as an even greater villain, a disruptor of the cruel order. But looking at the vast, star-strewn sky, a feeling he hadn't known in years stirred within him, a sense of purpose. It was a heavy burden, this purpose, but it was also a strange kind of liberation. He was no longer just surviving. He was living for something beyond himself, for a small, defiant flicker of hope that had been chained to a post in the middle of nowhere. Their journey was far from over, the future uncertain, but for the first time in a long time, Elias felt a strange, quiet certainty. The harsh wind, an unseen sculptor of the land, seemed to carry with it the ghosts of their past, whispering temptations of retreat, of the easier path. But Elias pressed on, driven by an instinct more profound than simple survival. The vast, indifferent night sky, studded with 1,000,000 indifferent stars, offered no solace, only a stark reminder of their minuscule existence in a cruel world. Yet, within that vastness, a delicate, almost imperceptible shift was occurring. Lena, once a silent specter of trauma, began to stir, to breathe life into the stillness around them. She would hum soft, tuneless melodies, ancient and mournful, born from a sorrow that transcended her years. She would point out constellations, her small finger tracing mythical beasts in the cosmic dust, her voice still quiet but gaining a gentle cadence. Elias listened silently, absorbing these fragments of her returning spirit. He found himself sharing memories, not of violence, but of the sparse beauty he had found in the wild, the silent majesty of a lone wolf, the surprising delicacy of a desert flower blooming against all odds. These were not confessions, but offerings, small, rough-hewn gifts of trust exchanged in the profound quiet of their shared journey. The hidden wooden bird, Lena's only tangible link to her lost past, became a profound symbol of their uncertain future. She would often hold it, tracing its worn edges, lost in thought. One evening, by a small, hidden campfire, she finally spoke of it, her voice barely above a whisper. "My mama carved it, before they took her." The words hung in the cold night air, heavy with unspoken pain, a window into the specific horror that had defined her young life. Elias said nothing, but his gaze softened, a rare fleeting vulnerability in his eyes. He understood. The world had taken so much from both of them. This was the open wound, the true source of her profound silence and fear. The mystery, slowly unveiled, was not a grand revelation, but a series of quiet, shattering truths. She spoke of her family, of the plantation, of the sudden, brutal separation, of the terror of the slave market, and then the inexplicable abandonment chained to that tree, a punishment so cruel it defied comprehension. Her story was not just her own. It was the story of countless others, a searing indictment of the societal figures who benefited from such suffering. Elias listened, his face a mask of stone, but within him, a slow, burning rage ignited. It was a familiar fire, but this time it was not fueled by personal grievance alone, but by a profound empathy for the injustice inflicted upon this child. He realized then the depth of his commitment. He wasn't just protecting her from the law, or from vengeful slave catchers. He was protecting her from the very system that had tried to break her, from the heartless belief that a human being could ever be property. This pivotal emotional climax, Not a singular event, but a dawning realization hardened his resolve. There was no turning back. Their bond, forged in desperation, was now tempered by a shared understanding of a world both brutal and beautiful, a world they were determined to navigate together, towards a future uncertain, yet undeniably their own. The desert, once a symbol of his isolation, now felt like a vast protective embrace, a silent accomplice in their desperate flight towards an elusive freedom. The journey continued, an endless cycle of riding under the vast indifferent sky, seeking meager shelter, and evading the ever-present shadow of pursuit. But within this ceaseless movement, a fragile sense of routine, of shared purpose, began to take root. Lena, with each passing day, shed more of the terror that had clung to her like a shroud. She still spoke little, but her eyes, once hollowed by fear, now held a glimmer of nascent hope, a quiet defiance that mirrored Elias's own. She began to observe the world around her with a sharpened curiosity, noticing the smallest details, a rare bloom pushing through cracked earth, the silent dance of vultures circling overhead, the distinct calls of unseen birds. Elias, in turn, found himself pointing out these small wonders, his gruff voice softening imperceptibly as he named a distant mountain range or explained the habits of a desert creature. He was teaching her to survive, yes, but also, perhaps unknowingly, teaching her to truly see, to find beauty even in desolation. He taught her how to track, how to read the subtle signs of the land, how to fire his old, heavy rifle, its weight almost too much for her small frame. He saw her burgeoning strength, not just physical, but an inner fortitude that spoke volumes of her resilience. The irony was not lost on him. An outlaw, a man who had spent his life avoiding society's rules, was now acting as a protector, a teacher, a guardian for a child cast out by that very society. His morality, once a murky blend of necessity and survival, was slowly, irrevocably reshaping itself. The line between right and wrong, once blurred by desperation, now seemed clearer, sharper, defined by the simple, undeniable truth of Lena's humanity. They encountered sparse settlements, dusty towns clinging precariously to the edges of civilization. Elias would skirt them, observing from a distance, gathering supplies when absolutely necessary, always alert to the dangers posed by the townsfolk, their suspicions, their biases, their willingness to turn in a runaway or an outlaw for a few dollars. He heard whispers of the pursuit, of the ghost and the runaway property, their story already morphing into legend, distorted by fear and prejudice. This reinforced his resolve. There was no place for them within the established order. Their only path was onward, deeper into the wild, towards an unknown, unwritten future. One evening, as the last sliver of sun dipped below the horizon, painting the clouds in bruised purples and fiery oranges, Lena looked at him, her gaze direct and unblinking. "Where are we going?" Her question was simple, yet profound, cutting to the very heart of their uncertain existence. Elias paused, staring into the flickering embers of their small fire. He had no grand destination, no safe haven promised, but he knew where they were, not going. Back. Back to chains, back to fear, back to a world that would deny her humanity. "Forward," he said, his voice low, his eyes fixed on the distant, darkening horizon. Always forward. The answer was vague, yet it held a promise, a commitment that transcended mere words. It was a promise of continued vigilance, of shared hardship, and perhaps of a freedom earned, one painful step at a time. The world was vast, dangerous, but no longer quite so empty. It held the potential for a new beginning, however fragile. The world they traversed remained unforgiving, a vast canvas of dust and sky, but a subtle shift had occurred within its bounds. The constant flight had begun to transform into a purposeful journey, propelled not just by the fear of pursuit, but by a quiet yearning for something undefined, something resembling peace. Elias, once a solitary wolf, found himself attuned to Lena's every need, her silent gestures speaking volumes, guiding his choices as much as his own instincts. He was no longer just running. He was building, slowly, painstakingly, a foundation for a life that had no blueprint. He taught her how to identify edible plants, how to track small game, how to find water where none seemed to exist. In return, Lena, with the boundless curiosity of youth, discovered forgotten joys. She would sketch crude drawings in the dirt with a stick, depicting their journey: the horse, Elias, and always the small wooden bird. These simple acts, these quiet moments of creation, were anchors in their uncertain existence, weaving a tapestry of shared experience. Their dialogue remained sparse, but each word was weighted with meaning, each glance a shared understanding. One evening, camped beneath the shelter of a massive rock formation, Lena looked up at the vast, star-dusted sky. "Will we ever stop running?" she asked, her voice soft, carrying a trace of the weariness they both felt. Elias watched the distant shimmer of a star, his face etched with the lines of his past. "Eventually," he murmured, the word a promise more than a certainty. "When there's nowhere left for them to follow, and no one left to claim what ain't theirs." His words hinted at a future beyond mere survival, a future where their freedom was not just an act of defiance, but a settled truth. He had begun to envision it, this elusive destination where the past could finally be laid to rest. He still carried the weight of his own transgressions, the phantom pains of his past choices, but they no longer crippled him. Instead, they fueled a quiet resolve, a determination to protect this one precious life, to ensure she found the peace he had long abandoned hope for himself. Their journey was transforming from an escape into a quest. The land itself became a character in their story, offering both harsh challenges and moments of unexpected solace. They found hidden springs, vast echoing canyons that swallowed their worries whole, and sunsets that painted the sky with a fierce, ephemeral beauty. Each sunrise was a testament to their continued survival, each sunset a silent blessing for another day endured. Elias, once a man whose gaze was always fixed on the past, now found himself looking forward, however cautiously. He was teaching Lena to live, yes, but she, in her quiet resilience, was teaching him to hope again, to believe in the possibility of a different future, one built not on shadows and flight, but on the fragile, enduring strength of their improbable bond. The end of their journey was not yet in sight, but the path, once obscured by fear, was slowly beginning to reveal itself, illuminated by the steadfast courage of an outlaw and the quiet determination of a girl who refused to be broken. The seasons turned, marking their passage not on a calendar, but on the changing hues of the desert, the shifting winds, the subtle alterations in Elias's worn, leathery face, and Lena's slow, steady growth. They had become a unit, an improbable family forged in the crucible of relentless pursuit and profound solitude. Elias's arm, once wounded, had healed, leaving a faint scar that matched the deeper, invisible marks etched onto his soul. Lena, once skeletal, had gained weight, her movements more fluid, her eyes holding a depth that spoke of wisdom far beyond her years, yet now tinged with a quiet, observant curiosity. The brutal, simple rhythm of their lives, riding, hunting, seeking water, evading danger, had woven itself into a tapestry of shared experience. Elias, the hardened outlaw, found himself a teacher, his gruff instructions softening with each passing day. He taught Lena how to read the stars, how to tell stories from the shapes of the clouds, how to listen to the whispers of the wind. In return, she taught him a resilience he had almost forgotten, a quiet joy in the small victories, a belief in something beyond the grim realities of survival. The wooden bird, her most cherished possession, remained a silent witness to their journey, a tangible link to a past that, though painful, fueled her determination. She would often hold it, her gaze distant, reflecting on the profound loss that had set her on this path. But now, when she looked at it, there was less sorrow and more resolve. It was not just a memory, but a promise to live, to thrive, to honor the life that had been taken from her. Their physical journey was long, taking them through vast forgotten territories, away from the established roots and the grasping hands of society. They navigated through scorching deserts and treacherous mountains, their only companions the elements, and the unwavering bond between them. Elias knew the world would never truly forget them, that the shadows of their past would always linger, but he had found something more powerful than fear, an enduring sense of purpose, This wasn't about avoiding capture anymore. It was about building a life, however unconventional, however isolated, where Lena could be free. They reached a secluded valley, hidden deep within a remote mountain range, a place Elias had known of but never truly considered for residence. It was a pocket of green amidst the stark rock, fed by a hidden spring, sheltered from the harsh winds. It was a place of astonishing beauty, a stark contrast to the brutal plains they had left behind. Here, the land offered sustenance, not just survival. He looked at Lena, her face alight with a quiet wonder, and a profound sense of peace settled within him. This was it. This was the somewhere they had been riding towards. Not a grand city or a reclaimed home, but a quiet, untouched sanctuary. It wasn't the end of all hardship, but it was the promise of a beginning, a fragile, hard-won peace. The outlaw had found his resting place not alone, but with the girl he had inadvertently saved, a girl who, in turn, had saved a piece of his own fractured soul. Their story, etched in the dust and sky, was far from over, but this was a quiet resolution, a pause in the relentless rhythm of a life lived on the run, a fragile dawn of hope in the heart of the wild.